Imagine driving home after a long day. You see flashing lights in your mirror. You pull over, hands on the wheel, heart pounding. But this isn't just any traffic stop. Within seconds, guns are pointed at you. Officers shouting. Fear taking over. Now imagine, you're the director of the FBI. That's exactly what happened to John Williams. And when the truth came out, the entire country erupted. If you believe in justice, if you believe these stories need to be told, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because this fight isn't over. It was a quiet evening in downtown Atlanta. The streets, still wet from an earlier rain, reflected the glow of traffic lights as cars rolled through intersections. A soft hum filled the air, horns in the distance, faint chatter from people walking along the sidewalks, the occasional siren wailing far away. It was just another ordinary night. For John Williams, it was supposed to be a normal drive home. He had spent the last 12 hours in meetings, buried in paperwork, discussing national security threats that most people would never even hear about. That was his life. High stakes, high pressure. But tonight, all he wanted was to get home, take off his suit, and finally relax. As he drove through the city, his mind drifted. He thought about his family. His wife had sent him a message earlier. "What do you want for dinner?" He hadn't responded yet. Maybe he would surprise her and pick up something on the way home. Maybe Italian. She loved Italian. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night jazz. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, syncing with the rhythm. The world outside felt calm. But calm never lasts. Just as he turned onto Peachtree Avenue, flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror. A police car. John's eyes flickered to his speedometer. 35 miles per hour. Right on the limit. He wasn't swerving. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, he signaled and pulled over. He exhaled slowly. This was routine. Nothing to worry about. Right? John turned off his engine, keeping both hands visible on the wheel. He had been in law enforcement for years. Long before he became the director of the FBI. He knew the drill. A shadow moved outside his window. Then a sharp tap on the glass. License and registration. The voice was firm. Cold. John nodded, moving slowly. "Sure, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" No answer. Instead, the flashlight beam hit his face. A long pause. The officer's breathing was slow, controlled. John had been in situations like this before, on the other side. He had trained officers, led investigations, stood before Congress. But at this moment, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just a black man in America pulled over at night. John reached into the glove compartment, carefully retrieving his registration. His fingers brushed against his FBI identification badge, but he didn't grab it. Not yet. He handed over his documents. The officer took them, stepping back toward his patrol car without another word. John glanced at his side mirror, watching. Something felt off. The officer wasn't running his license. Instead, he was talking into his radio. His free hand hovered over his holster. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. A few moments later, 2 more police cars pulled up. Backup. Why would they need backup? His heartbeat picked up. He had seen these situations play out before, for other black men who didn't have his credentials, his title, his training. He knew how quickly things could spiral. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife. "You coming home soon?" He didn't reply. The officer returned, this time with 2 others. Their hands rested near their weapons. The first officer leaned down again, voice sharper now. "Step out of the car." John blinked. Step out? What? His instincts kicked in. He stayed calm. Never escalate. Never argue. Just comply. He took a slow breath and spoke evenly. "Officer, is there a reason I need to step out?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "I said get out of the car." John didn't move. Instead, he reached into his inside jacket pocket. Deliberate, slow, clear. And then he pulled out his FBI badge. The officer's expression changed. Confusion. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of backing off, the officer's hand went straight to his gun. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. John froze. His mind raced. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This was something else. And it was only just beginning. The road was unusually quiet for a Thursday night. The city of Atlanta, usually buzzing with life, had settled into a slow rhythm. Streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The occasional car rolled by, headlights slicing through the night, but none slowed down. None noticed what was happening on the side of the road. John Williams sat still in his seat, his breathing steady but controlled. The flashing red and blue lights from the 3 squad cars bathed his face in an alternating glow. A cruel rhythm. A warning sign. Behind him, the Atlanta skyline stood tall, an outline of glass and steel against the dark sky. Just past that was home. Safety. His wife. His daughter. But right now they felt a world away. John had been in situations before where seconds mattered, where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. But those moments had always been in war zones. In high-stakes FBI operations. Not on his own city streets. Not 2 miles from his home. For over 2 decades, John had dedicated his life to law enforcement. He had worked cases that spanned the country, dismantled criminal organizations, led some of the biggest investigations in U.S. history. He had advised presidents, sat in classified intelligence meetings, and made decisions that had altered the course of national security. He had trained police officers. He had taught them how to handle tense situations, how to de-escalate conflict, how to recognize threats. And now, at 51 years old, he found himself on the opposite end of the badge. A black man. A target. A suspect. None of these officers knew who he was. Not yet. Would it even matter when they did? The officer standing at his driver's side door was Sergeant Daniel Crowley. Crowley was in his late 40s, a veteran of the force, but with a reputation that walked a fine line between aggressive and reckless. The kind of cop who had been the subject of one too many complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics, but had never faced real consequences. He was the one barking orders now, his hand hovering near his holster. Behind him stood Officer Mark Dugan, younger, newer to the force. He didn't speak, just watched. His stance was rigid, his eyes darting between John and Crowley. He looked uncertain, nervous. And then there was Officer Sean Whitaker, positioned near the 2nd squad car, hand on the radio. He was the one who had called for backup. His posture was confident, almost too confident. John recognized that stance. It was the stance of a man who thought he was in control. The stance of a man who wasn't expecting to be challenged. John knew what was happening. He had seen this before. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a test. A test of how much power these officers thought they had. A test of how far they could push him before he broke. And John knew one simple truth. The moment he lost his composure, he lost everything. His FBI badge sat heavy in his hand. The gold lettering caught the light for a split second before he set it down on the dashboard. He had hoped, prayed, that the moment the officers saw it, they would pause. Take a breath. Reassess the situation. But Crowley didn't even blink. Instead, his voice sharpened. I said, step out of the car. The hand near his gun inched closer. John could feel the weight of history pressing down on this moment. Would tonight add his name to the list? His mind raced through every possible outcome. No matter what he chose, he knew one thing. None of his training could fully prepare him for what happened next. For a brief moment, John's eyes flicked to his side mirror. A black SUV rolled by in the distance. Someone inside was recording. Good. At least someone would see what was about to happen. He inhaled, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to step out. And then, a hand reached for his door handle. And that's when everything changed. John Williams stayed perfectly still, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. Every move mattered now. Every breath, every shift of his hands, every glance, it all had consequences. Sergeant Daniel Crowley's grip on the door handle was firm, his stance wide, body squared off like he was ready for a fight. His other hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered weapon. Behind him, Officer Mark Dugan stood stiff, his hand twitching near his taser. His posture betrayed something Crowley didn't have, hesitation. John recognized the signs. Dugan wasn't sure. Wasn't fully on board. Good. Maybe there was still a way to pull this situation back from the edge. But before John could speak, before he could de-escalate like he had taught hundreds of officers before, Crowley made his move. Get out. Now. Crowley grabbed John's arm. A hard grip. Too hard. The kind of grip meant not for control but dominance. John didn't pull away. Didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head slowly and met Crowley's gaze. And what John saw in his eyes was familiar. Not just authority. Not just anger. Resentment. This wasn't about a routine stop. This wasn't about traffic laws. This was about power. And in this moment, John could tell, Crowley had already decided how this night was supposed to end. A car rolled by. Slowed. Then another. On the opposite side of the street, someone stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching. A woman, maybe in her 30s, phone in her hand, camera already recording. More people would stop soon. John knew that. Crowley knew that. And Crowley didn't like it. "I said get out." Crowley snapped, yanking harder. John moved deliberately, his FBI badge still in plain view on the dashboard. "Officer," John said, his voice even, controlled, "I am fully cooperating. But I need to know the reason for this stop." Silence. Not from Crowley. From Dugan. From Officer Sean Whitaker, who was still near the second squad car, watching but not stepping in. They were waiting. Waiting to see if John would break first. If he would get angry. If he would resist. If he would give them an excuse. But John had spent 25 years in law enforcement. He knew the game they were playing. And he wasn't about to lose. "Sergeant." John's voice was firm, clear, unwavering. "You need to take a step back." Crowley laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Or what?" he sneered. "You think flashing that badge makes you special?" John could feel the air shifting. The tension thickened. It wasn't just about him anymore. The moment he saw Crowley's finger twitch, his hand hovering closer over his gun, John knew. He had seconds. Seconds before a decision was made for him. And then, a new voice cut through the air. "Sergeant." Crowley hesitated. Just for a second. Dugan had spoken. The younger officer stepped forward, eyes flicking from John to Crowley. "Let's just check his ID," Dugan said. His voice wasn't firm like Crowley's, but it carried something else. Doubt. And in this kind of situation, doubt was dangerous. Crowley's jaw clenched. His grip on John's arm tightened for a moment. Then finally he let go. John exhaled slowly. Small victory. But it wasn't over. Not even close. The situation should have calmed down by now. But it didn't. Because at that moment, 2 more squad cars pulled up. 4 more officers. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was a scene. More flashing lights. More eyes. More people watching from the sidewalk, recording. John's pulse remained steady, but his mind was calculating. They were escalating, not de-escalating. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about making a statement. And John was beginning to realize something far more dangerous than the aggression in Crowley's stance. This was planned. They knew who he was now. They just didn't care. A car door slammed. And then, someone different stepped out. Not a cop. Not wearing a uniform. But a suit. Tall, broad shoulders, confident stride. This wasn't an officer responding to a call. This was someone who had been waiting for this moment. John's stomach tightened. He had spent years dealing with people like this. Not just in policing, but in politics, in government, in the shadows. Someone had pulled strings. Someone wanted this confrontation. And that's when John knew. He was in more danger than he had ever been before. The man in the suit stepped forward, eyes locking onto John. Recognition. This wasn't a mistake. This had been set up. John's mind raced through the possibilities. Who would want him in this position? Who would go this far? Then the man in the suit spoke. "Step out of the car. Now." His voice was cold. Calculated. Not like the officers. Not filled with anger or frustration. Just control. John didn't move. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't about to play their game. He met the man's gaze. "I'd like to know why I'm being stopped." A slow smile spread across the man's face. And then, the words that changed everything. "You already know why, Director Williams?" Silence. The street noise faded. John felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. They knew exactly who he was. And they were still going through with this. That meant this wasn't about a traffic stop at all. This was about something much bigger. John shifted his eyes toward the officers. Dugan looked shaken. His posture had changed completely, his confidence was gone. He didn't sign up for this. Even Crowley, as arrogant as he was, looked unsure now. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. John studied them. They didn't know. They thought this was just another stop. Another chance to show dominance. But now they realized they had pulled over the director of the FBI. And their careers were already over. John's mind worked fast. Why would someone want this confrontation? Who had ordered it? It had to be someone high up. Someone with power. And then he saw it. A black SUV parked across the street. Tinted windows. No markings. But John knew exactly what kind of vehicle that was. Government. This wasn't about a simple stop. This was an operation. Crowley, still shaken but trying to regain control, did something reckless. He reached for his cuffs. Click, click. The metal gleamed under the flashing red and blue lights. "Step out of the vehicle," Crowley repeated, this time his voice uneven. John felt a slow anger rise inside him. He had worked for decades to make sure law enforcement followed the right procedures. And yet here he was, about to be arrested on false charges. He knew the routine. Once they cuffed him, they would put him in the back of a squad car. They would take him to a station. And once they got him off the street, away from cameras, anything could happen. Then, a phone rang. Not John's. The man in the suit pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket, looked at the screen, and froze. Whatever name was on that screen, it wasn't someone he expected to call. John saw his fingers hesitate before finally answering. He stepped away, lowered his voice, but John still caught one phrase. "Yes, sir. I understand." Silence. Then the man in the suit turned back toward Crowley. And everything changed. "Let him go." Crowley blinked. "Sir, he..." "Let him go." The man's tone left no room for argument. The cuffs vanished. Crowley stepped back. The tension in the air snapped. Dugan looked like he wanted to disappear. Whitaker still hadn't said a word. John didn't move. Didn't speak. But inside his mind was racing. Something had just happened. Someone high up had stepped in. And now John needed to know why. The man in the suit turned to John. For the first time his expression had changed. He no longer looked smug. No longer looked in control. Instead, he looked like someone who had just lost a game he thought he was winning. "Enjoy your evening, Director," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The officers scrambled to follow. And just like that, the street was silent again. John sat back in his seat, gripping the wheel. His hands were steady. But his heart was beating fast. This wasn't over. Someone had sent those men. Someone wanted this confrontation. But someone higher up had stopped it. Who was pulling the strings? And more importantly, what were they trying to hide? The flashing lights were gone. The squad cars had disappeared into the night. But the moment was far from over. Because this wasn't just another case of police overreach. This was an attempted arrest of the director of the FBI. And by the time John Williams pulled into his driveway that night, the entire country already knew. At exactly 2:37 a.m., a video surfaced on Twitter. A shaky but clear clip, filmed by the woman who had been standing on the sidewalk recording everything. The caption was short but powerful. "WTF? They just pulled a gun on the FBI director." The clip showed the moment Crowley grabbed John's arm. The moment he demanded he get out of the car. The look on John's face when the man in the suit said his name. It wasn't long before hashtags started trending. Hashtag justice for John Williams. Hashtag police abuse of power. Hashtag FBI vs local cops. By sunrise, the video had racked up over 2.5 million views. And the police department? Dead silent. At 9:04 a.m., the local police department finally responded. A bland, robotic statement from their public affairs office was posted on their website and Twitter page. Last night, an incident occurred involving an officer and a driver who was later identified as an FBI official. The department is currently reviewing the situation and will provide further updates as needed. No apology. No details. Just damage control. And the internet wasn't having it. Comments flooded in. Later identified as an FBI official. So what, he wasn't human before that? They just admitted they didn't know who he was. Meaning they did this to a regular black man all the time. Firing isn't enough. Crowley should be arrested. Within an hour, the police department shut off their comment section. Too late. The fire had already spread. By 10 a.m., major news outlets were covering the story. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, The New York Times. Every channel had the same question. How did this happen? Some hosts tried to downplay it. Perhaps the officers were just following protocol. Others didn't hold back. A uniform does not give you the right to abuse power. But the biggest headline of the day came from the Washington Post. FBI director pulled over, held at gunpoint. What happens to black men who aren't in power? And just like that, the story was no longer just about John Williams. It was about every black man in America. Within 24 hours, Washington, D.C. got involved. The Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. The mayor of the city demanded accountability. The White House was monitoring the situation. And then, the FBI released a statement. It was short but powerful. The events of last night were unacceptable. We will ensure full transparency and accountability. For a government agency that rarely commented on police matters, this was huge. It meant one thing. The FBI wasn't letting this go. By the afternoon, Sergeant Crowley was placed on administrative leave. So were Dugan and Whitaker. But for most people that wasn't enough. They wanted arrest. They wanted charges. And soon, pressure mounted for the police chief himself to resign. He refused. Until something else leaked. That night, an anonymous source sent a shocking piece of evidence to a journalist at The Guardian. A leaked audio recording from a police radio transmission during John Williams' stop. In the clip, before Crowley even approached the car, a voice was heard saying, "Let's make him sweat." And then, something far worse. These types always think they're above the law. These types. The moment the audio was verified, the police department was done. The chief had no choice. He resigned immediately. And Crowley? He was arrested that night. For 2 days, John stayed silent. He didn't make any statements. Didn't do interviews. And then, on the 3rd day, he held a press conference. Standing in front of a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing, he spoke carefully, deliberately. His words echoed across the nation. "I have spent my career believing in justice. But this incident proves what so many Black Americans already know. Justice is not applied equally in this country. If I, the director of the FBI, can be treated this way, what happens to the Black men and women who don't have the power to fight back? This isn't just about me. This is about every American who has ever been told their rights don't matter." The speech was raw, powerful, unscripted, and it set off a movement. By the end of the week, thousands took to the streets. Protests in Washington, D.C., New York, and Atlanta. Marches in front of local police stations. Signs reading, "Who polices the police?" For weeks, the country debated, argued, fought. Some called John a hero. Others claimed he was playing the race card. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just another viral moment. This was a reckoning. In the end, the fallout was massive. Crowley was fired and charged with misconduct. Dugan resigned under pressure. The city passed new policies limiting police stops. But was it justice? That depended on who you asked. John Williams knew this fight wasn't over. Because while he had walked away that night, too many others hadn't. And until something changed for good, it could happen again. Anytime. Anywhere. To anyone. The protests slowed. The headlines faded. But the story of John Williams would never be forgotten. Because this wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about every traffic stop. Every time a Black man has had to keep both hands visible just to stay alive. Every time a Black woman has had to explain herself to an officer just to be heard. Every time someone says, "Not all cops are bad," while another Black life is ruined by the ones who are. This was a moment in history. But it was also a reminder. John Williams got lucky. Because he had power. Because he had a badge. Because his name meant something. But what about the Black men and women who don't have those things? What about the ones who don't get their stories told on national news? Who don't have millions of people demanding justice for them? Where is their justice? The system wasn't built to protect people like John Williams. It wasn't built to protect you. And until real changes happen, until the laws, the policies, the entire system is rewritten, this will keep happening. Tomorrow. Next week. Next year. And one day it might not be someone else's story. It might be yours. The question remains. Will this just be another case that trends for a few weeks and then disappears? Or will this be the moment that finally sparks real change? Because change doesn't come from just watching. Change comes from acting. From demanding better. From holding those in power accountable. How many more innocent Black lives have to be stopped, harassed, arrested, or killed before something changes? How many more protests, how many more hashtags, how many more names? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just one story. This is a pattern. And until that pattern is broken, until the system is truly fixed, we are all just waiting for the next name to be added to the list. If you believe stories like this need to be told, if you believe the truth needs to be heard, then make sure to subscribe to this channel. Click that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Leave a comment. What do you think needs to change in America? Because this conversation isn't over. And neither is this fight. Justice for all.